Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor André Brock, Jr., Associate Professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech University. He's the author of the book, Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, which was published by New York University Press. We are label mates. Of Distributed Blackness, Tracy McMillan Cottom writes, a timely and lively intervention in our understanding of blackness in the digital age. How are you doing today, Professor Brock?
I'm well, OG. How are you?
I'm good. Talk a little bit about the title of this book, Distributed Blackness.
So I've been talking about Black people in online spaces for a long time, but as you well know, we were always to be found in bits and pieces in salons and corners, right? Never understood as a world web-wide presence. And so one of the things with the advent of social media, particularly Twitter, for which I study, but also Facebook and the like, is that now you see us everywhere, right? And that distribution of our thinking and our discourse has led to increased visibility for good and for ill. But yeah, I like to think of us as a community online.
Yeah, one of the interesting, analog examples that you use of this, very early in the book is the Green Book, as like an earlier technology that represents this kind of version of distributed blackness. Unpack that for a little bit.
So I was really fascinated by Victor Green's The Negro Motorist Green Book, and I make fun of it in my presentations because, there was that movie with Viggo Mortensen. Right. I was like, no, this is not how to teach Black people how to write chicken. What it is, though, is it's a directory, like a Yahoo Open Directory from the early days of the web, where people send in submissions of places where Black people could revive themselves, could vilify themselves. So there's leisure locations, there's spaces on the highway system that salesmen and the like used to go to that were allowed them a moment of respite from both travel, because they didn't have AC or good radios in their car, but also to help keep themselves safe from folk who lived in sundown towns or just weren't really happy with Black folk driving through their spaces. And so in positioning itself as a space for Black life on a network, the United States highway system, I see it as one of the best examples of an informational Blackness, but also a distribution of Blackness in a technological way.
Talk a little bit about your coming to this work. We think about the early work of folks like Londra Nelson and Lisa Nakamura, but you seem to have a sense of the work, thinking about your doctoral dissertation, which really talked about the ways that the internet was valued and not valued in the context of Hurricane Katrina. But what was it about this relatively new technology, at least in terms of accessibility, and its role in race, and more importantly, its role in Blackness, that drew you to do this research? So
I came up on this stuff post right around 2001, right? And so, the digital divide studies were really big then. At that point, they'd issued the broadband series. But before that, they were talking about Black folk didn't have access to these technologies either because they didn't have the money, or they didn't have the know-how, or they didn't have the connectivity, right? And that just did not square with my views of who I was and the people I grew up with. So at the time, I was living in New York, and I see all these young folk with their two-way pagers. I mean, Tribe Called Quest had a song called Sky Pager, right? And so, and I had a Commodore 64 when I was in school in '85, right? So it's not like we weren't on the web, it's that we weren't visible to people on the web. And so one of the things I've been trying to do across my work is show how we've always been here and how we bring ourselves to these online spaces.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because we hear all about these digital divides, and like if you lived in the hood, there was always somebody in the G apartment on the 7th floor that had cable when no one else in the neighborhood had cable, right? And it's like so somebody figured that out. You describe in what's happening this moment is that Black folk have made the internet a Black space.
Yes.
And we know there's some all kinds of conversations about Black Twitter and things like that. And we also know it by the way that whenever Blackness shows up in certain kind of spaces, whiteness flees. to some extent. But talk about this process of how, when we think about online culture now, we almost inherently think Blackness as opposed to anything else.
I mean, I think it works in much the same way that when people think about American culture outside of the US, they think about Blackness first, right? We are the spirit that animates this dusty old project of modernity and equality, right? And so that our joy of life, and something I try to talk about in the book using libidinal economy, our excess of life is what animates this particular space. That being said, it's also that the way that we talk to one another and the way that we conceive of each other as pieces of a whole actually works really well with the internet infrastructure. Servers are relatively agnostic as to who they get the information from. They don't put them in categories because their interest is in prioritizing traffic across the network. And I think of Black people in the same way. One of the things I talk about is there's this really lovely article by Anne Warfield Rawls, and she uses Du Bois' double consciousness to highlight the differences between the ways Black people and white people interact with one another. So she says, white people greet each other by saying, what do you do? Who are you? Right? And Black folk greet each other like, how's your mom and them? Right? How you been? Right? And so that hailing, instead of hailing in a category, right, we're hailing each other to say, what are our social connections and how has your family been, the people that bring you life? And I see us doing that in every space. Like I could holler out New Black Man in Exile, right? Because you've been doing this for a minute. You brought Black studies to the web in a way that has been really accessible and interesting to a lot of people, including myself, but making it visible in that space.
Yeah, that concept of fictive kin, right? That's a thing that almost propels our relationships and help, Black Twitter to become a thing. Like most scholars, you realize that you had to come up with your own critical theory. So if you could expound a little bit upon critical technocultural discourse analysis, which is kind of the theory that you weave throughout distributed Blackness.
So there are a couple of pieces to it. One of it is it's grounded in computer-mediated communication research. The other part is that it's, again, grounded in double consciousness. And something Du Bois said that really stuck with me. He said, lions don't have historians, right? And so in the histories of technology that we read or are exposed to through the media, you never hear about the Black people who toil away as operators like Venus Green's work or the first mathematicians until Margot Shetterly's work. You don't really hear about that, but we were there, right? And so one of the things for CTDA is that it must examine technology use from the perspective of the group that you're examining. My focus is Black folks. So I use Du Bois a lot. I've used Henry Louis Gates signifying. I'm working with intersectionality and Black feminist theory because I want to center our perspective, our philosophy first. Other folk have used it for feminism, for queer theory and the like, but this is where it has to start from. And then the second part for computer-mediated communication, I argue, and this is somewhat like Latour and actor network theory, that the technology does some work as well. Right? You have to understand what the technology is doing as well as how people understand themselves with the relationship to the technology to have a holistic understanding of what's going on, right? And in that way, you get a more, I would argue, a fuller understanding of not just people being acted on by devices, right? Or people acting as if the devices weren't there, but a kind of reciprocal relationship, right? Where both and are working together.
Do you have a background in computer science?
I have a PhD in information science, but I'm kind of at right angles to that field because what I do is more properly understood as science and technology studies or information studies. But I do have a semi-technical background. I've been a tinkerer since birth. And I love trying to figure out how the devices do what they do, right? And so I can't code, but I do a lot of interface analysis. I have a little bit of background on HCI. So I try to understand how these technologies make meaning for us as we use them.
I mean, because that's one of the things that's really fascinating about the book. We rarely get folks who have that quality that can bring the critical theory aspect to it with some sort of knowledge of the computer science aspect of it, right? And I think that's one of the things that's writ large, throughout this book in terms of some of the arguments that you make. When did you decide to come to Twitter? Because, we think about the earliest adopters of Twitter, those folks who literally their Twitter name is just their last name, right? And so, they were kind of standing there, in the beginning. But when did Twitter become a resource for you, both as an object of study, but also in terms of a utility for the kind of work that you do?
So early on, as the social networking services began to explode post to 9/11, right? So every 5 minutes there was a new service. And so I began this practice of, as soon as there was a service, I went and grabbed the username that I wanted to have, right? So there are lots of services that don't exist anymore that have my favorite username. Twitter was one of those places. So I signed up for it in 2008, right? Which is really right on the cusp of when it started to pop after it exploded at South by Southwest. But I'll be honest and say I didn't really get into it until 2010, when I started realizing what people were saying about it and how Blackness was being evoked in these spaces in a way that was unlike what had been going on in blogs, which I also have written about. You remember the Jenna 6, right? And spaces like that. And Black Planet, right? It's very different because somehow it became outward facing, thanks to the hashtag, the early use of the hashtag, and then the introduction of the trending topic algorithm in 2009. Right, all of a sudden, white folk could see what we were doing, and now there's much more scrutiny. So I felt it was important to hurry up and issue something that demonstrated that what we were doing is not play. What we were doing is not, we don't understand the system. It's a sophisticated exercise of Blackness and we keep up with the new, right, on this new technological platform.
Yeah, so, I was a late adopter of Firefox, right? I use it a great deal now. So I missed the Blackbird moment. Talk a little bit about this browser called Blackbird, right? In which somebody thought it was important to create a framework, some sort of interactive space that spoke to Blackness in a way that some of the other browsers weren't at the time.
So there's always been a movement of Black technological respectability. We always have had spaces where we wanted to create a curated experience for Black folk to find stuff that we thought they needed. And Africana is a really good example of this, right? Africana.com, right? And so these three entrepreneurs, three Black men, decided to basically use the open source model of Mozilla to create a Black folk branded browser. Called it Blackbird, had the interface was black, because why not? And it had a couple of features that were really interesting. The one that I write about the most is the Google targeted search, but also they had features where they wanted to encourage Black community. And it's interesting to me because it really was just a regular browser. They made some decisions in hindsight that they probably could have avoided, like forcing people to sign into it when most people at the time, a lot of people at the time were using the browser at work. So you can't install a whole new browser at work. Like that's just not gonna work. Right? And when you come home, that's not the place where you immediately think to go, is this brand new browser I just found, right? That was a bad decision. But the other part was how it was received. And so Black folk in particular had a really kind of divided approach to it. They were like, one, I don't want to be segregated off from the wider internet, right? If you just create a space, one of the earlier mentions of a filter bubble, right? You create a space where it's only Black folk talking about Black stuff, that means I'm missing out, which is interesting, right? The other part was, and you can see this on Twitter now, is who is these Black folk? How do they know what kind of Black folk I am, right? How dare they curate information and resources, not recognizing the heterogeneity of Blackness and that they don't know me like that, right? And so those two perspectives from an inter-community were really interesting. And then of course you have the outer community. White folk on the tech websites were like, oh, this is where they're gonna find how to get out of weapons charges and where 40 ounces are on sale. And that kind of rhetoric actually still continues to this day. Right. And so it's really interesting. And folk keep asking me like, what do you see? When will Black people create their own? And I bring up Blackbird every time, because just because Black folk create it, don't mean Black folk love it. And I'll give you an example, the Black soul food restaurant. Right? If you put a Black soul food restaurant in the neighborhood, Black folk are not going to immediately flock to it because they're like, well, who's cooking? And how's their potato salad? Like, we are really critical of Black efforts, right? We don't just do it. Contrary to what conservatives and Black Republicans think, we don't just do things because Black folk are doing it. We are critical in every aspect of our exercise in this daily life.
I love that. You theorize about the ratchet, because Twitter became this really interesting space. I mean, you were just talking about this kind of Black digital respectability, and when we saw that really focus in on things, it was in terms of controlling this kind of activity amongst Black folks, that made people feel uncomfortable, the ratchet, if you will. But you talk about the way in which that was something that was of value in these spaces that allowed really Black folks to be able to feel and be felt around, the kind of controls that were being placed on them socially. So talk a little bit about the, online culture, Twitter, and ratchetness.
So the book doesn't really do it justice because I didn't want to be sensationalist about it, right? I didn't want to emphasize stuff like hot ghetto mess, right? Where we were really, or there was a Tumblr site called Yo Mom in the Club, right? I didn't want to highlight those spaces where we dragged our own people. What I wanted to do is stretch out the concept of the ratchet to include us being our Black ass selves in spaces that were not intended for us or ready to receive us, right? And so from that perspective, for me, the ratchet works really well. And so in the book, one of the examples I use is the N-word Navy. Can I say N-word on your show?
Of course, absolutely.
So the nigger Navy, right? which became this ratchet moment because it could have been a space where we could have done what conservatives think we always do, the mob mentality, where we just rise up and say Yahoo needs to be canceled. And we didn't do that. What we did instead was we took that and made it our own. We added humor to it. We added life to it. Right. So for me, the ratchet is this excess of life, right? This refusal to be constrained by either Black respectability or modernity or whiteness. We just gonna be ourselves in whatever space we occupy. And I find that to be super valuable. I even go so far as to argue that without that quality of the ratchet, we would not have had the emotional bandwidth to take on Ferguson and the like, because you can do protests on these spaces, but you have to have a core of a space where we can return to heal ourselves. Like the philosopher Cat Williams says, you can't be mad at breakfast, right? You have to eat the bacon. You can't gangbang on it. So the ratchet is that space where we can come back and rage, but also, do the Black girl magic and the Black boy joy and all these spaces.
And you mentioned around the Black respectability piece, right? On the one hand, it overcorrects for ratchetness, and then under really theorizes racism, right? Because they're trying to turn Black folks who are on the internet into these kind of civil subjects, right? That fit very nicely and can articulate and debate around issues of Blackness instead of the kind of rage, that we are forced to bring to the table so often.
You see it. And I was really encouraged by Ron Judy's work. I know he has a new book out that I have to get my brain ready for, but he wrote this beautiful essay called On Nigga Authenticity.
It is my favorite essay of all times. Right?
Such a great essay.
I mean, me and Murray Foreman went back and forth when we put together That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies reader. It's like, no, this essay has to be in this volume. But please go on and talk about the genius of R.A.T. Judy.
It's so beautiful because not only does he talk about how we understand gangster hip hop, right, which still has relevance to this day, but he talks about the carceral nature of the Black community and wanting to celebrate the bad man while also conforming itself to fit within the structures of white supremacy, right? And I'm like, God, that's solid. That's so solid, right? And so I talk about it to a certain extent in terms of governmentality of Black respectability, right? It is a governmental space where we're trying to say, if you folk act right, we might could get integration in school so teachers can put our kids in jail. Like it's just like we have not always thought through what the Black respectability does. And that essay, the Judy essay, really helps to start orienting your gaze in the direction, is this the Afro future that you want?
Yeah, you take on Afro-pessimism in the latter parts of the book, and it's interesting, right? Because you really do put it in the same space of anti-Blackness, right? You say both anti-Blackness and Afro-pessimism are devoid of the creative and inventive capacities of Blackness, right? Like the things that make us who we are. Right, in terms of survival techniques, making a way out of no way, right? That we don't see that in anti-Blackness, but ironically, right, we don't see it in this kind of theoretical movement that so many people are being drawn to at this moment. Talk a little bit about that.
You got it. It's really fascinating to me, and I love the way Moten and Wilderson and Sexton really think through Afro. And although I'm beginning to become aware that they did not really reach back as far as they should have to Winter and Spillers, right? But the idea that you can examine Black cultural objects and see their glory and their creativity, but then construct a theory which says, well, ain't nobody gonna see this. That really drove me nuts, right? In part because it's like it's almost there, it's almost far enough. And so Moten went so far before he was pulled back to talk about Afro-optimism, right? And that's the part where I really attached to. And he was clear later on, both he and Sexton, that they're both pessimism and optimism, the Afro versions, are two halves of a whole, right? You can't have one without the other. But it took somebody calling them out on that to bring it back to that spark. But I love Afro-optimism because I encountered it through Afro-pessimism, where Moten talks about Blackness as a celebration of thought, right? Of dancing on the graves of modernity and the cemetery of political death, social death, right? That to me is really generative, right? Because it talks about how we are constantly in this mode where we're making $1 out of 15 cents, but we're not doing it in a woe is me framework, although we do complain, it ain't fun, right? But we also managed to celebrate that point. So I've been referencing a lot Kashawn Thompson, her version of Black Girl Magic, and she talks about Black girl doing hair in the kitchen, Black girls who wear weave and wigs, right? Right, trans Black girls, Black girls who are have kids and are single mothers. And to me, like, those folk are the people who I'm really concerned with, the mundane, the everyday Black person, because they do find joy in ways that my bourgeois self does not always appreciate or do, but it's still just as valuable. And so Afro-pessimism doesn't do a lot to speak to that. And so I try to push back against it.
So, I see you out there on Twitter being André Brock Jr. How are you feeling about this space now, given everything that's been going down with COVID, the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, ... How are you feeling about the vitality, really, of the social space, Black Twitter, at this moment?
So, technical note, every time somebody complains to me, and they're usually white, how terrible Twitter is, I ask, do you curate your followers, right? Because if you don't pick and choose the people you associate with, of course, you're not going to have a good experience, right? That being said, I wrote about this aspect of Twitter in 2012, and I'm sorry to say that I've been proven right, but Twitter is a space for ritual catharsis, whether that ritual is the hashtagification of Breonna Taylor's name to where everybody was taking it up and saying it and making memes about it, or if it's something as simple as how we responded to Patty and Gladys on the Verses, right? Where instead of posting their music, which would have been the first thing to do, we posted pictures of the hard red strawberry candies and Jean Naté and White Diamond Cologne, right? Because we have this space where we could build out our associations and through those associations, our love for Blackness in this space. That's really unlike any space we've ever had, right? Like I said, you've been doing this blog stuff for a minute, right? And blogs are really in many ways still a one-way conversation. You have your comment sections, but mostly it's a monologue where you get to go off and opine about certain things, and then your audience comes in. Twitter is that space where we can immediately do the clapback or the celebration, right? And I love it for that. I see it as an immensely generative space, right? And while understanding that, and it has been used against us in some way. So the reproduction of Black death via the algorithm, where it just keeps posting those things to your timeline because people have liked it, right? That's a problem. But also, it's also a moment where we get to understand we act as a witness, right? Because in many cases, like, this as well, our ancestors moved up north because they fled state-sanctioned civil violence from white people. And those stories don't get told. Right? You might hear about it if somebody passes and they reminisce, but a lot of times that stuff it went with their ancestors, right? But here we have in real time, and an archive of the iniquities that have been handed down, that are being put upon us in the present day. And I see that as incredibly valuable, right? At a time, I think Ida B. Wells would have loved to have this type of documentation of the stuff that goes on without having to go physically to these places and put her life in danger. And so having that space where we can reflect upon it, which happens on Twitter, although people don't say about it much, but react to it and build community around it and say, you know, hugs to you, sis. Feminista Jones, she put out this hashtag, you okay, sis, right? Because women were really going through it, as they always do, right? But that was a moment where people could say, hey, hashtag, you okay, sis? What's going on? What can I do to help?
I'm walking with my son and I see a guy roll up on a young woman who's pushing a stroller and grab her arm to get her attention. And then for the next like 10 minutes or so walking with her, even though she said that she needed to go, she wasn't interested in what he was saying, he would not leave her alone. And that's when I asked her, are you okay, sis? And I called her sis because she was black, and, you know, I know that that kind of phrasing is pretty much, you know, African-American, you know, vernacular English, and I know that that kind of interaction doesn't really happen as much with others, but it was for me, and it was authentic for me. And after it happened, and I got into this back and forth with this young man who was offended that I was asking her if she was okay. And I understood why, but I still felt the need to address her as the victim and not him. I didn't tell him to back off. I just made myself present and I said, are you okay? If they're okay, if they're fine, they say they are, and that's fine. They retain their agency. They have the right to say, I'm okay, I'm not. But if they're not okay, at least they know that someone was there, right? Someone cared enough.
And I see that as, again, the possibilities of Afro-optimism are present in this space on an everyday basis. Sorry, I nerded out, my bad. I like talking about this stuff. I appreciate you giving me this space.
We've been joined today with Professor André Brock, Jr., Associate Professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech University. He's the author of the just published Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, published by New York University Press. It was great talking to you, Professor Brock.
Thank you very much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We take